Judith Miller is a classic case of the reporter becoming the story. She is here this morning with a new chapter. Miller's page one exclusives of the New York Times were cited by the Bush administration. The White House used them to help make the case for war in Iraq, pointing to reports of nuclear capabilities. In a 2002 interview, Vice President Cheney said, quote, "There's a story in the New York Times this morning Saddam has been seeking to acquire, and we have been able to intercept and prevent him from acquiring through this particular channel the kinds of tubes that are necessary to build a centrifuge. No weapons of mass destruction were found." Miller's reputation took a devastating hit. She resigned from the Times in 2005. She explores what happened in her new memoir. It is called The Story, a Reporter's Journey. The book is published by Simon & Schuster, a division of CBS. Welcome. Let me start with this. Tell us exactly, and precise as you can, how you look at this and what you did wrong and what you did right and what you regret.
That's the book.
I know.
No, I think I wrote the book because I wanted to look at the events that had taken us to war and the role of the media and my own role, and to examine what stories were right, what stories people said were wrong that turned out to be right or partly wrong. But more than that, I wanted to look at this meme, this narrative that so many Americans believe we were lied into this war. People were pressured into giving estimates they didn't believe in. People like me were spoon-fed information. And in my experience, none of that was true. I couldn't find individuals who had been pressured.
But did the New York Times, did Dick Cheney quote an article by you or cite an article by you as saying we have to go to war because there are weapons of nuclear mass destruction in Iraq?
He was quoting our article, which was based on the intelligence that he was getting, the top secret information, when President Bush asked his CIA director, "Are you sure there are weapons there? You're confident?" He's told slam dunk. Well, if the President of the United States is told, yes, in fact, we have these weapons there, is the New York Times, the Washington Post, or CBS supposed to say, no, actually, what we're supposed to do is try and examine the claims? And I did the very best I could to do that. Most of my stories are filled with people who went on the record saying, we believe this is true. We believe this is scary. We believe this is a threat to the nation.
So what did you do wrong?
I think what I did wrong was I wasn't permitted by my paper to go back and look at those stories when we had more information. You know, I went to Iraq. I spent 4 months with soldiers who were top secret, embedded, looking at the hunt. You know, when we didn't find weapons, I said, wow, what happened here? We had a massive intelligence failure. I wanted to come back and look at that. I wasn't permitted to do that. That's what we do wrong. We're all going to make mistakes, but when we don't go back and look at those mistakes and correct them,
why do you think, Judy, that your reporting was singled out? Because as you write in the book, you collaborated on a lot of the stories, and other stories from other colleagues were later disputed. Why do you think that you were singled out?
Well, first of all, I was responsible for covering WMD in general. I had been covering Iraqi weapons for a long, long time, Soviet nuclear weapons, Soviet biological weapons. But second of all, since I wrote a lot of these stories with male colleagues, I don't know, maybe being a woman had something to do with it. I mean, the aluminum tube story that Dick Cheney quoted was written with Michael Gordon, a superb reporter who is still writing for the Times and doing excellent work.
When you look back on that episode, because particularly it was the front page piece with you and Michael Gordon that talked about Iraq's efforts to secure these aluminum tubes for centrifuges to build a nuclear weapon.
Right.
It was on Sunday morning it came out. The Vice President of the United States, Mr. Cheney, went on Meet the Press, cited your story essentially as evidence, as proof.
Right.
And then you also had Condoleezza Rice on CNN that same day saying we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. All of the intelligence at the time, though, was that they were 5 to 7 years away from a nuclear weapon. That was the current intelligence from the CIA. What the Times and what I've read is that suggested was that there wasn't enough in what was put on the front page. It was editors who made mistakes too, noting these qualifications, you know, saying, look, but this doesn't show that. Do you regret any of that?
No, I don't. I'll tell you why. Because 5 days later, Michael Gordon and I, and actually I was the one who was pushing for this, wrote a story saying, you know that aluminum tube story we told you about?
Oh, right.
There's a big debate in the intelligence community about this, and many people don't believe this. So, you know, that's the kind of follow-up that I'd hoped others would do and draw conclusions. And I certainly wanted to go on doing it. Had I been permitted to, I'd probably still be at the Times, but
Should you have
I
been
had to
more
go to
questioning
jail.
and more rigorous in your in the sources that you had?
You know, Charlie, I couldn't have been. I talk in this book about how I went to an analyst's house. I'd heard he was a dissident. I paced up and down. I felt like a journalistic cliche. You know, there I am with my little notebook. And he just said, I can't talk to you, can't talk to you about this. I tried everything, and most of my sources were on the record.
This is serious. Wall Street Journal has an excerpt quoting you about suggesting that Special Counsel Patrick J. Fitzgerald, in his prosecution of Scooter Liddy, induced you to give what you now realize was false testimony. That's a serious charge against a federal prosecutor, saying he induced me to give false testimony.
What I'm saying is that he had information that would have helped jog my memory about something which I hadn't considered very important at the time, which is who leaked information about a CIA agent. I was more focused on how the heck did we go to war on the basis of a faulty intelligence estimate that was 100% wrong? So when I heard about this other story, I wasn't really concentrating on it. My notes were very, very unclear. Mr. Fitzgerald, who had a lot of time to prepare this case, had information that could have perhaps jogged my memory, and he didn't give it to me. And then when I began to look at this case, I realized he didn't provide the defense with a lot of information that they needed to make the best case they could. I realized that prosecutors are supposed to get convictions, but the truth shouldn't be a victim of their pursuit.
Now, you describe yourself, once described smart, fearless, relentless, to now to pushy, would do anything for a scoop, warmonger who helped sell and carry out the war. You said you laughed and you cried.
Right, well,
I
I've
want
been
to know
called
when you
worse.
laughed and you cried.
I've been called worse, and you have to take the blows. But I think what was most disappointing was my paper's effort to kind of deflect attention from the pre-war reporting that it claimed was flawed to one or two individuals. And in this case, me, I don't think it was fair. I don't think it was right.
Thank you, Jude.
Thank you.